Hello, I'm Michael Peake, and I'm here to introduce the third and final book in the Hide-Away Canoe Club trilogy, titled The Coppermine and Beyond. This is a book for lovers of northern wilderness rivers and the history behind them, which is considerable. All of our trips were historically based journeys, which we report on in here. Plus, we tell the story of the original trips, often with their own photos and illustrations. The cover photo is Rocky Defile Rapids on the Coppermine River. With more than 24 chapters, this book looks at more than just canoe trips, but interesting people, places, and photos along the way. Here's a route map of all our trips, and the ones in green and yellow are featured in the Coppermine and Beyond. 3 of the trips, the main northern ones, have large chapters, but all the rivers and trips are covered. These are the first 2 books, A Northern Journey about our cross-Barrenland trip to name a river for Eric Morse, and Ungava, 7 trips across the remote and rugged northern Ungava Peninsula. Though many trips are covered in this book, the centerpiece of it is Lands Forlorn, the 1911-1912 expedition by George Douglas from Great Bear Lake to the Coppermine with incredible photos. Douglas's route north, as with everyone back before 1920, was along the Athabasca River, shown here the Athabasca Brigade, whose York boats took everyone north, then down the Slave and Mackenzie by steamship, and in Douglas's case, by York boat and canoe to the Coppermine River. Douglas's lovely photo of the steamship Mackenzie River at Wrigley on the upper Mackenzie River, en route to Fort McPherson. Douglas would go to the next stop, which is Toledo, or then called Fort Norman. And you can see the boat is taking on cordwood for fuel and dropping whatever cargo they had. It was a lifeline. Among Douglas's fellow passengers on the trip were the newly famous author Robert Service, who was returning to the Yukon, this time in a birch bark canoe he had just purchased on the way, and he would take that back to Dawson City via the Rat and Porcupine Rivers. There's a chapter in the book on it. And the Radford Street trip, just heading out. They would be murdered 2 years later. The real Lands Forlorn trip begins dragging your canoes up the Dease River, as we are here 80 years after Douglas started out at this spot he named the Old Man of Hoy, after the Scottish landmark. We were lucky. We had ABS canoes. He had a Peterborough Cedar strip that meant no hard dragging. It might be surprising to many people that the land in the far north was much more populated 100 years ago than now. Inuit were still living nomadically, hunting and moving across the barren lands, and John Hornby is shown having a cup of tea with them in behind. George Douglas in the middle, with his flags en route by foot to the Coppermine in the spring of 1912, and little Catherine Card, a young girl who was accompanying her family to Fort Simpson, where they hoped to start an experimental farm. I think the greatest thing about Lands Forlorn are the incredible photographs of life back then, and especially of the Inuit, like this beautiful family that he met coming back from the ocean, heading back up the Coppermine. Little did Douglas or this family know this way of life would soon vanish. After we retraced the Lands Forlorn route in 1991, the next year we took a different route from Great Bear to the upper Coppermine to do most of the river, which meant this incredible Rocky Defile Rapids, which we were scouting. And we ended up running, which was so exciting, we have no good pictures of it. That's the real proof. Also that year, we were able to locate the paddles that Douglas had carved in anticipation of the Coppermine breaking up in their spring 1912 trip. The one on the left we returned to Mrs. Douglas, who was still alive at the time, and she donated it to the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. The final flurry of the wonderful Coppermine River is Bloody Falls, and Peter Scott shown here in a time exposure watching the Arctic char work their way up this mighty river. It's a historic and incredible spot to camp, as people have done for hundreds of years. Let's finish off having a look inside the book. This is the preface, and this one is loaded with historic photos, as is the book, as we look back into the history of Canadian northern canoeing. Lands Forlorn is the heart of this book, and obviously we take a detailed look at Douglas's trip, plus ours and others who went through the region. But it's typical of many trips, some never retraced or heard of again, that with a little digging you can learn a lot. The other two principal trips include across the Arctic Mountains, that goes from Mackenzie River over McDougall Pass down to the Yukon, that Service did, Eric Morse did, and we did. And the Arctic Land Expedition, which is based on an 1840s suggestion to rescue the missing Franklin expedition. Guy Blanchard tried it in 1925, and in 1995, I think we found the missing link, and you're looking at it. Of course, Saskatchewan's Churchill River is relatively easy to reach and well known, an incredible river still with loads of history and runnable rapids. And for us, Quetico and Lake Superior were very special places before we began northern trips, and during and even after. It's unbeatable canoeing. And finally, a couple of Ontario rivers that, although not as historically rich, are great canoeing. Winisita Bay, which flows into Hudson Bay, and you get a chance to see a polar bear if you're prepared. And the Missinaibi, our first real northern trip, which we did starting in late May, so there was plenty of water, and it was a trip that really hooked us into paddling these big rivers in the north. I hope that gives you an idea of what this book is all about. There's a lot there. It's available at hacc.ca, either as a printed book or a PDF. The book price is yet to be determined because it's privately printed. We will sell it at cost once we get it printed, but more information on the website.